Europe has been our great dream, and there is no alternative to Europe. But we have to come down from our hopes, which are unreal, to reality. Think back of the Lisbon agenda. It was said that the period from 2000 to 2010 would be the period of Europe. Europe would be the most dynamic region of the whole world. The truth, unfortunately, was it was the laggard of the world. No region of the world, no big region, was growing as slowly as Europe. We have to stop that nonsense. We have to talk about reality rather than explaining dreams which are impossible to fulfill. For Italy, it wasn't a good period in the euro. From 1995, the Madrid summit, when the euro was announced, and when it was clear that it would really come in a few years, and it was clear which countries would come, until now, as other speakers have also said, the Italian growth rate has been the lowest of all European countries. I can draw the line at the Ural, and I wouldn't find any other European country whose growth rate was that low. And actually, even though all these statistics show rightly that Germany came out of the crisis very well in 2010, 11, and 12, over the whole period, from 1995 until now, Germany was having the second lowest growth rate of all European countries. We did have our euro crisis because we came overvalued into the euro, because capital was leaving the country. Germany had the lowest net investment rate of all OECD countries for years. Actually, for years, until 2005, Germany had a growth rate which was even lower than the Italian one. We had a mass unemployment. We had too high wages. And that was the situation when the government really had to do something. Chancellor Schröder, introduced his Agenda 2010, basically meaning that the welfare state was reduced and the replacement incomes which the welfare state offers for doing nothing were reduced. Thereby, the wage scale was widened to the lower end. Wages fell, and Germany gradually became more competitive. After the crisis, this has helped Germany, but the overall performance still is not very good. Actually, the whole European experiment with the euro was a failure. I say that although I always was an enthusiastic defender of the euro. I remember very well 20 years ago when we had debates and my older colleagues warned about the distortions, that I said, no, we have to go ahead, you're too pessimistic, it will all work out. And if we are honest as scientists, we must say it simply didn't work out. Milton Friedman and others were perfectly right with their forecast that 10 years after the foundation of the euro, he even specified the time period, Europe would be in big problems. This is simply true. The euro has not even been a peace project, as Helmut Kohl had argued at the time, because the strife and hassle in Europe is now bigger than ever since the war, at least in Western Europe. This is also a truth, unfortunate. What happened in the euro was that we got very many capital movements out of Germany and other northern countries, the Netherlands, for example, or Finland, into the rest of the world, into southern Europe. Not Italy, but the other European countries. And this enormous capital flow, cheap credit at low interest rates, we saw the graph, how the interest convergence happened, created an inflationary bubble. In principle, this was good. We wanted that. We wanted the capital to go from the capital-rich to the poorer countries, because there one could expect more growth than would be lost in the core, in the north. But this whole thing got too much momentum, too much capital was flowing. There was a bubble being built up. The real estate prices grew quickly, and then the expectation was that this would last forever, and there was overinvestment. In Spain, this is very clear. In Greece, it was more the government sector that used the opportunity of borrowing at low interest rates and paying higher wages and employing lots of additional people. In the end, it made no difference where the foreign credit was flowing, to the government sector or to the construction sector, because the construction workers paid taxes, so the government participated in Spain, and in Greece, the government employees built their homes out of the credit-financed wage increases. So the whole economy was driven up artificially. The prices and the wages went up, current account deficits developed, imports were growing with these nominal income increases, export competitiveness was being undermined, and more and more got these countries used to the drug of cheap credit from abroad. My interpretation of what happened was, here it might differ a little bit, that we had too much safety in the system, too much firing power of the ECB. The investors forgot all their care and went into investments which in the end were not safe enough. The risk premia were artificially being reduced. Also by regulatory mistakes, we allowed the banks of Europe to accumulate government bonds without holding any equity capital against them, and the same for the insurance companies. Then, in 2007, the American crisis swept over to Europe, and all of a sudden, the private capital from the north was no longer willing to finance the current account deficits of the south. And then there was the big problem. Since then, we have the crisis. One would need actually a change, a realignment in the price structure in Europe to improve the situation, but this is very difficult to get. We have certain improvements in the current account situation, but simply because of the recession in Southern Europe, with declining incomes, you import less, so a mass unemployment. But that's not the solution which we want. We want a substitution effect towards domestic products, away from foreign products, and there's only one way of getting it. We need a realignment of prices. What in earlier days was the regular devaluation, which took place in Italy and other countries, that we now need through a change in relative prices. Italy increased its price level relative to Germany, including the initial revaluation of the lira, I think it was 1996, by 50% relative to Germany, 5-0. Relative to the rest of the Eurozone, by at least something like 30%. So Italy belongs to those countries that have become too expensive. The miracle is that Italy didn't have the boom as the others, which is very difficult to understand why that happened. But it is certainly true, as Luigi Zingales had said, that the government misused the opportunity. The initial governments, there were many governments since then, since 1995, were prudent. There was this interest reduction. They used that to drive down the public debt. It came down from 120 to 103% of GDP, but now, then after a while, the Berlusconis came, and everything was moving in the other direction again. Had Italy saved the interest advantage which the euro brought to Italy, its debt GDP ratio today would be 18%. 818. It's unbelievable. But it was consumed. The government consumed it. The interest advantage for Italy from the euro was bigger than the whole VAT revenue for Italy. But it was consumed. And the government sector was becoming more and more inefficient, as we heard. I fully endorse this interpretation. Be it as it may, the countries of Southern Europe have become too expensive, and they now have to become cheaper, or Germany and the Netherlands have to become more expensive. Either we have an inflation in Northern Europe, or we have a deflation in Southern Europe, or we have a combination of both. There is no way to avoid this. Some people speak of reforms as if reforms of something in themselves would be able to improve the situation. I tell you, the necessary reforms in the labor market would be effective if and only to the extent that they reduce the wages relative to other countries and therefore allow prices to be reduced relative to other countries. There's no way, I think, to avoid this conclusion. Some European politicians dream of growth programs. But when they speak of growth programs, they mean borrowing. They mean Keynesian debt stimulus. But that's a short-term relief only, with negative long-term consequences. In particular, the result would be that the necessary realignment of wages and prices does not take place. How much has happened thus far? Well, during the crisis, since 2007, when the interbank market broke down the first time, most of the Southern European countries have become even more expensive relative to their competitors in the Eurozone, rather than beginning this process of realignment, including Italy. Italy has, even since 2007, inflated faster than Germany. And the forecast for this year is, again, Italy will inflate faster than Germany. How come? You can't do that. Italy seems to inflate its prices as if the euro wasn't there, but there's the euro. That cannot happen. And that's the major difficulty. Now, Keynes and Friedman, the great economists, antagonists, agreed in one thing. You cannot easily devalue by cutting your wages and prices. The resistance is enormous by the unions, by everyone else. And I believe for some countries in the Eurozone, this problem is so big that there is hardly any solution. Take Greece. If you want to squeeze Greece with austerity programs, as we do, you create a mass unemployment. More than 50% of the young people are unemployed. The total rate of unemployment is moving towards 30%. And still, one doesn't see that Greece becomes cheaper. They would have to cut their relative price level, according to a study of Goldman Sachs, from 100 to 70. But it has not happened. They have become more expensive during the crisis. A little bit in the last year, it's moving in the right direction, but relative, the previous years were always moving in the wrong direction. Portugal, according to Goldman Sachs, would have to cut its price level from 100 to 65. The way is even longer. Spain would have to cut the price level from 100 to 80. And interestingly enough, France would have to do the same. The French economy is part of the problem. I don't believe the growth forecast, by the way, which you showed for France. France has an unemployment problem. The unemployment rate is increasing sharply. France is way too expensive. The value-added share of the manufacturing sector in France is just 9% of GDP, which is less than the British one, less than half of the German one. By that comparison, Italy is doing well. Italy is still having a strong manufacturing sector. The northern Italian economy is the strongest of Europe in terms of GDP per capita. And according to Goldman Sachs, the necessary devaluation for Italy is not 20% from 100 to 80, but they say only from 100 to 90 or 85. So I believe Italy can make it. Italy can make it with similar reforms as we carried out in Germany. If you make the labor market flexible, allow wages to decline relatively, and in particular have a wider spread for the low-quality workers, then you will be able to generate more jobs and to grow. But the truth is, you can't enforce that with growth programs, so to say, debt-financed growth programs. You have to go through an austerity period. There's no way to avoid that. Germany went through its own austerity period. We had our own euro crisis, which, to my surprise, was not noticed outside Germany. You did not probably know about it, but it was a very severe crisis. And out of this crisis, the politicians were then able to carry out the necessary reforms, and the unions lost momentum, and they agreed to lower wage increases, and we got a relative deflation, which in the end helped. I don't see any alternative. So countries like Spain, France, would need a decade or 1.5 decades of stagnation for the inflation rates of these countries to stay sufficiently behind the average in the Eurozone so as to improve their competitiveness. For Italy, the period is shorter. But there is no miracle. We don't have the gun. I'm not convinced. We don't have a miracle solution out of this mess in which we have ended. And if we don't succeed in letting this realignment of prices materialize, then I don't think the euro will survive, to be honest. I think it should survive. I think it's worth defending the euro, by all means, but the simple political will is not enough. There is no primacy of the laws of politics over the laws of economics, as our politicians always proclaim. This belief that there is a primacy of the laws of politics over the laws of economics has driven us into this mess. We have to return back to reality. Thank you for your attention.